The early life of Frederick Douglass is inseparable from the institution of slavery, which defined not only the conditions of his birth, but also the psychological and social structures that he would eventually devote his life to dismantling. Born in February 1818 in Tuckahoe, Maryland, Douglass entered a world where human beings were regarded as property, and the circumstances of his birth denied him the most basic rights and connections. From the outset, his identity was shaped by absence of freedom, of family, of recognition. One of the most defining aspects of Douglass's early life was the mystery surrounding his paternity. He never knew the exact date of his birth, and the identity of his father remained a subject of speculation. It was widely presumed that his father was a white man, possibly his owner, but no confirmation was ever offered. This uncertainty exemplifies the way slavery erased familial bonds and rendered personal history irrelevant in the eyes of society. For Douglass, the denial of this knowledge was not merely a personal loss, but a symbol of the systemic dehumanization inherent to slavery. Douglass's mother, Harriet Bailey, played a limited but deeply influential role in his early life. Enslaved on a different plantation several miles away, she was allowed no more than rare nighttime visits with her son. These visits, conducted in secrecy and under threat of punishment, were fleeting yet significant. Harriet would walk miles after her day's labor just to see her child, only to leave before dawn. Her perseverance left an impression on Douglass, though her death when he was still a young child severed one of his few emotional connections and underscored the cruelty of a system that fractured families at will. In the absence of his mother, Douglass was raised largely by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who cared for him and other grandchildren in a small cabin on the edge of the plantation. Yet even this semblance of stability was transient. Once Douglass was considered old enough to work, he was separated from Betsy and transferred to the main plantation house. The transition marked his induction into the world of forced labor and complete subjugation, reinforcing that his value was tied solely to his utility as property. His earliest years on the plantation exposed him to the harsh realities of slavery, including hunger, cold, and violence. Douglass witnessed brutal punishments inflicted upon other enslaved people, especially women, whose bodies were violated with impunity. These formative experiences etched a permanent awareness of injustice into his psyche. Even as a child, he sensed that the cruelty around him was not just painful, it was profoundly wrong. The lack of consistent care and affection characterized the upbringing of many enslaved children, and Douglass was no exception. Meals were meager, clothing was inadequate, and affection was scarce. The institution of slavery was designed to suppress individuality and foster dependency, ensuring that children like Douglass would grow up fearing authority rather than trusting it. Despite these conditions, Douglass began to show early signs of independence and critical thinking, traits that would later fuel his resistance. When he was around 8 years old, Douglass was sent to Baltimore to live with the Auld family. This relocation was a pivotal moment in his life, offering him his first glimpse of a world beyond the plantation. In Baltimore, he encountered a relatively more humane environment, though he remained a slave. The Aulds, especially Sophia Auld in the beginning, treated him with a degree of kindness that was foreign to his previous experiences. This shift in environment would later prove critical to his intellectual development. It was in the Auld household that Douglass first came into contact with formal education. Sophia Auld initially began teaching him the alphabet, unaware of the social transgression this act represented. When her husband discovered her actions, he promptly forbade further instruction, declaring that literacy would ruin a slave by making him unfit for servitude. This moment revealed to Douglas the connection between knowledge and power. It was a revelation that would ignite a lifelong pursuit of education and self-liberation. Though still a child, Douglas began to internalize the idea that slavery was not natural or inevitable, but constructed and maintained through ignorance and coercion. The contrast between his experiences in the rural South and urban Baltimore highlighted the variability of the slave experience and underscored the arbitrary nature of the system. These insights deepened his determination to seek freedom, not only for himself, but ultimately for others who shared his condition. For Frederick Douglass, the path to liberation began not with an act of physical defiance, but with the quiet, subversive act of learning to read and write. In a world where the enslaved were legally barred from education, literacy became both a dangerous weapon and an act of resistance. It was a forbidden pursuit, one that placed Douglass in direct conflict with the institution of slavery and the values that upheld it. But his quest for knowledge would prove to be not just an intellectual endeavor, but a profound act of self-empowerment, one that would shape his future and alter the course of history. When Douglass was first sent to Baltimore, his life took an unexpected turn. It was there, under the roof of the Auld family, that he encountered the possibility of education. At first, Sophia Auld, the wife of his owner, was kind enough to teach him the alphabet. This small act of kindness was unintentional. She had no idea that by teaching a slave to read, she was breaking the law. Her husband, Hugh Auld, discovered the lessons and vehemently forbade his wife from continuing. He argued that educating a slave would unfit them for servitude and make them discontented. But for Douglass, the prohibition only fueled his desire to learn more. The denial of further instruction was a turning point for Douglass. Rather than extinguishing his thirst for knowledge, it ignited a fire. He realized that education was a key that could unlock his mind, a key that many slaves were denied. In this recognition, he understood the true nature of slavery. Not only was it a system of physical subjugation, but also sought to stifle intellectual growth and personal autonomy. It became evident to him that those in power feared educated slaves because knowledge could inspire rebellion, and thus, it was deliberately kept from them. Douglass, determined to continue learning, embarked on his own covert education. He began by taking advantage of any opportunity to practice his reading skills. When he was not at work, he would often search for reading material, finding solace in the few scraps of literature available to him. He would frequently visit the homes of local poor white children, hoping to engage them in exchanges of knowledge. With quiet persistence, he learned to read more fluently, turning the city of Baltimore itself into his classroom. The learning process, however, was not simple. Douglass faced countless obstacles, from the disapproval of those around him to the lack of resources. He often had to make do with what little was available, scouring the streets for discarded books and newspapers. But his determination to become literate remained unwavering. Even as a child, he recognized that reading was not just about comprehension. It was about understanding the world in a way that others could not. Reading opened doors to new ideas, and it allowed Douglass to begin questioning the society in which he lived. One of Douglass's most significant moments of growth came through reading The Columbian Order, a book that would profoundly shape his understanding of freedom, human rights, and his own sense of self-worth. This book, which included speeches by famous orators and dialogues about liberty, was instrumental in expanding Douglass's views on the relationship between education and personal freedom. The book's lessons reinforced his belief that slavery was unnatural and morally wrong, and they filled him with a sense of urgency to seek freedom, not just for himself, but for all enslaved people. As Douglass's literacy grew, so too did his understanding of the broader world. He began to see the contradictions inherent in American society, a nation that prided itself on liberty, yet condoned the enslavement of millions. The more he read, the more he became convinced that his intellectual awakening was an essential part of his eventual escape from slavery. Knowledge became his shield against the mental and emotional shackles of servitude, and it provided him with the intellectual tools to dismantle the oppressive system that had kept him, and millions like him, in bondage. The personal transformation Douglass experienced through education was both a silent rebellion and a defiant claim to his own humanity. While he was still bound by physical chains, he understood that the chains of ignorance were far more insidious and harder to escape. His efforts to acquire knowledge were not just acts of self-improvement. They were acts of defiance against a system that sought to keep him in the dark. Through literacy, he broke free from the psychological bondage of slavery, and in doing so, he laid the foundation for the leader he would become. By the time Douglass reached his teens, he had gained enough literacy to engage in deeper philosophical reflection. He began to read widely, devouring works of history, politics, and literature. His intellectual curiosity grew insatiable, and he soon recognized that the world of the enslaved was not the world of the free. As Douglass's mind expanded, so did his understanding of the brutality of slavery. He could no longer view his enslavement as an isolated experience, but as part of a broader societal issue that needed to be addressed. In many ways, Douglass's early pursuit of education shaped his identity as a leader. It was through education that he first discovered his voice, his ability to speak out against injustice. Knowledge became the weapon that Douglass would wield for the rest of his life, whether through his powerful speeches or his writings. The lessons he learned in secret would go on to influence not only his own life, but also the lives of countless others, as he became a symbol of the transformative power of education and the resilience of the human spirit. Frederick Douglass's intellectual awakening in Baltimore was not merely an abstract pursuit of knowledge. It became the foundation of his resistance to the chains that bound him. As he absorbed the world around him through books, he began to grasp the enormity of his condition and the system that sustained it. The fire of resistance that would burn in Douglass for the rest of his life was sparked during these early years, as he experienced the first flickers of autonomy and learned that the power of the mind could transcend the limits placed on his body. Despite the progress Douglass made in his education, life as an enslaved person was never without its hardships. After his initial time in Baltimore, he was sent back to the rural plantations, where conditions were harsher and opportunities for intellectual growth were more limited. The transition was a jarring reminder that the physical restrictions of slavery were still present, even as Douglass's mental world had expanded. He felt the weight of the contradictions in his life more deeply than ever. While his mind was freed, his body remained enslaved. During his time back on the plantation, Douglass was put to work in grueling labor, primarily in the fields and later in the household. The physical demands of slavery, combined with the psychological weight of the oppression, often felt overwhelming. Yet, it was during these trials that Douglass began to cultivate his inner strength. He realized that resistance was not always about external defiance. Sometimes it was about maintaining one's sense of dignity in a world designed to strip it away. His growing intellectual capabilities allowed him to see through the facade of the slave system and understand it as a complex, deliberate structure designed to degrade and control. One of the key moments in Douglass's development as a resistance figure occurred when he was sent to work for Edward Covey, a notorious slave breaker known for his cruelty. Covey's role was to break the spirit of rebellious slaves, And it was here that Douglass would face his greatest personal test. Under Covey's constant physical and emotional abuse, Douglass's spirit began to break. He later described this time as one of deep humiliation, where his body bore the brunt of both the pain and the psychological assault of slavery. It seemed, for a time, that he might be crushed under the weight of Covey's cruelty. But then something changed. The breaking point came when, after a particularly brutal encounter with Covey, Douglass fought back. In an unexpected and momentous act of defiance, he physically resisted Covey's assault, striking back with such force that Covey was momentarily stunned. This act of resistance, though brief, became a turning point for Douglass. It was not only a reclaiming of his dignity, but also a demonstration of his refusal to be broken. This moment, though small in the grand scheme of his life, marked the beginning of his unwavering commitment to fighting back against the forces that sought to oppress him. The fight with Covey did not lead to immediate freedom, but it was a pivotal moment in Douglass's development. It symbolized his realization that the battle against slavery was not just about escape. It was about asserting one's humanity in the face of systemic dehumanization. From that point on, Douglass would never again fully accept the notion that he was powerless. The spark of resistance that was kindled in that moment would grow into a fire that would fuel his actions as a leader in the abolitionist movement. Douglass's resistance, however, was not always physical. His intellect and his understanding of slavery as a social and political institution shaped his desire to speak out. The realization that knowledge was power continued to drive him, and it was in his growing awareness of the moral and philosophical arguments against slavery that his true resistance began to take shape. He began to read works by abolitionists, including the writings of William Lloyd Garrison, whose ideas would soon inspire Douglass to join the movement in earnest. The more Douglass learned, the more resolute he became in his belief that slavery must be destroyed. Douglass's decision to resist was not born solely of the desire for personal freedom. It was grounded in a deep moral conviction. He had learned through his experiences and readings that slavery was not just a political or economic institution, but a profound moral wrong. The cruelty of slavery, its degradation of both the enslaved and the enslavers, became increasingly clear to him. He saw that the system of slavery did not only harm the enslaved, but also corrupted the entire nation. In this realization, Douglass found his mission: to resist, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of the millions who had yet to find their voice. This shift in Douglass's perspective was significant. As his awareness of the broader implications of slavery grew, so did his desire to act. He realized that his fight could not remain a personal one. It had to become a collective struggle, one that required him to speak out publicly and to challenge the very institutions that upheld slavery. Douglass's sense of resistance evolved from a private rebellion to a public call for action, one that would inspire countless others to join the fight for freedom. By the time Douglass made the life-changing decision to escape slavery, the fire of resistance within him had been fully stoked. The mental preparation for escape had been long in the making. He had come to understand the costs and risks involved in fleeing slavery, but he also knew that the price of staying was far higher. His escape was not just an act of personal liberation. It was an act of resistance against the society that had enslaved him. As he prepared to flee, he was driven by the belief that freedom was not simply a right, but a necessity for survival, dignity, and self-actualization. After years of physical and mental struggles, Frederick Douglass's resolve to escape slavery was finally solidified by an unwavering desire for freedom. The years spent under the oppressive systems of slavery had imbued him with a deep understanding of the brutalities that defined his existence. Yet the hope for escape remained the flickering light that kept him going. The decision to flee Maryland, the place of his birth and years of enslavement, was not taken lightly. It would be a perilous journey, fraught with risks and dangers. But Douglass had become resolute in his pursuit of liberation. His mind, already freed by education and self-awareness, yearned to break the final chains that confined his body. Douglass's escape from slavery was planned meticulously, with every step considered and reconsidered in the face of the vast dangers involved. Unlike many other enslaved people who sought freedom through stealth or physical flight alone, Douglass's decision was not impulsive. He carefully observed the patterns of life on the plantation, watching the ebb and flow of daily tasks and routines. He took note of the weaknesses in his owner's defenses and learned how to exploit them. As he began to see his chance, he knew that freedom would require both cunning and courage. His escape was also facilitated by the growing network of abolitionists, many of whom had begun to organize ways to help slaves escape to the North. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, was gaining momentum during this period, and it would become a crucial element in Douglass's eventual flight. Although he did not initially know the full scope of this network, Douglass was aware of its existence through his interactions with other enslaved individuals and abolitionists. The news of others who had escaped to freedom gave him the hope and courage he needed to take that first crucial step. Douglass's escape was planned for a time when he would be least suspected. He borrowed the identity of a free black sailor named Stanley, with whom he had become acquainted during his time in Baltimore. Douglass's knowledge of the region, the geography, and the routes available to him was invaluable, but he knew that every decision could prove fatal. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, could lead to his capture and death. He trusted his instincts and the few close allies who had helped him, knowing that the consequences of failure were unimaginable. The actual escape was terrifying. Douglass left his plantation under the cover of night, moving quickly through the city streets of Baltimore to the docks, where he would catch a train heading north. His heart pounded with every step, as every shadow seemed to harbor a potential threat. The fact that he was leaving everything behind, the only life he had known, the risk of betraying family members, and the uncertainty of the future, made his escape both a moment of triumph and an overwhelming emotional storm. Yet, the fear of the unknown paled in comparison to the dread of living the life of a slave. The journey north was fraught with uncertainty. Douglass crossed through several states, always wary of the potential for recognition. Every town, every train station was a potential trap. Slave catchers, both formal and informal, were constantly on the lookout for runaway slaves, and even a small misstep could mean recapture. Douglass's anxiety was compounded by the knowledge that, were he to be caught, the punishment would likely be brutal, torture, branding, or even death. He eventually arrived in New York City, the first stop in his journey to freedom. New York represented a significant milestone in Douglass's life, as it was a place where his status as a free man could be formally recognized. Yet, his sense of freedom was still tentative. As an escaped slave, Douglass knew that he was still vulnerable, even in the North. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1850, made it legal for slave owners to pursue runaways in free states, and Douglass understood that he could not afford to remain complacent. Despite his arrival in a free state, he remained cautious and vigilant. After a brief stay in New York, Douglass sought further refuge in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he would settle into a new life as a free man. New Bedford, a bustling port city, offered opportunities for employment and anonymity, both of which Douglass desperately needed. Here, he was able to build a new life, adopting the name Frederick Douglass to protect his identity. It was in New Bedford that he would soon meet others in the abolitionist movement and begin to work actively toward the cause of freedom for all enslaved individuals. As Douglass settled into his new life, he reflected on the magnitude of his escape. It was not simply an individual act of survival. It was a challenge to the very system that had sought to dehumanize and control him. His escape was a symbolic victory for all enslaved people, a message that the system of slavery could be resisted and ultimately defeated. But the escape also marked the beginning of a new phase in Douglass's life. His newfound freedom, however hard-earned, also came with a moral responsibility to help others achieve the same. It was not enough for Douglass to be free. He now recognized his duty to fight for the freedom of others. Frederick Douglass's life in the North was one of reinvention and reinvigoration. While his escape from slavery marked a personal triumph, it was not the end of his journey. Freed from physical chains, Douglass quickly recognized that his true calling lay not just in the pursuit of personal freedom, but in the fight to liberate others. His experience as a former slave, combined with his growing understanding of the injustice of slavery, made him one of the most powerful voices in the abolitionist movement. It was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, that Douglass began to find his voice, a voice that would echo through the halls of history and inspire generations to come. Though still a young man, Douglass's reputation as an abolitionist quickly grew. His journey to activism began with the realization that in order to truly be free, he needed to speak out for those who could not. He was deeply aware that his voice had power, and with it, he could challenge the entrenched systems of oppression that had kept millions of people enslaved. As he settled into life in New Bedford, Douglass became involved in the local abolitionist circles, attending meetings and speaking to anyone who would listen. His personal experiences, his suffering as a slave, his escape, and his newfound freedom gave him the authority to speak with a depth and conviction that resonated deeply with his audiences. It wasn't long before Douglass began to make waves in the abolitionist community. In 1841, he was invited to speak at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, an opportunity that would prove to be a turning point in his life. At first, Douglass was hesitant. He had never spoken publicly before and feared that his accent or lack of formal education might diminish his credibility. However, the invitation was too significant to refuse. With a sense of nervous determination, he took the stage. The moment he began speaking, all his fears dissolved. Douglass's words were powerful, clear, and impassioned. He spoke with the raw emotion and directness of someone who had lived through the horrors of slavery. He shared his own story with the crowd, describing the cruelty, the degradation, and the injustice he had witnessed and endured. As he spoke, his words took on a life of their own, becoming more than just his personal experience. They became the experiences of all enslaved people. His speech resonated with the crowd in ways that few speakers could. By the time he finished, Douglass had not only captivated his listeners, but also established himself as a formidable voice in the abolitionist movement. Douglass's public speaking career was born from this moment of courage. He began to travel widely, delivering lectures across the northern states. His speeches, often infused with both a deep moral outrage and a logical argument against slavery, gained him significant attention. He was a powerful orator, and his ability to blend personal narrative with broader social and political analysis made him an effective advocate for abolition. His speeches didn't just appeal to emotion. They also called on his audience to recognize the contradictions within their own society. He questioned how a nation that valued liberty and equality could simultaneously uphold the institution of slavery. What made Douglass stand out in the abolitionist movement was not just his message, but his unique position as a former slave. His first-hand account of the brutality of slavery was unparalleled. While many abolitionists spoke from moral or religious grounds, Douglass's testimony was grounded in lived experience. He could speak with authority about the horrors that enslaved people endured. He had lived it. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845, became one of the most significant works of its time, further solidifying his position as a leading figure in the movement. But Douglass was not just a man of words. His activism extended beyond speeches and writings. He became involved in political advocacy, using his platform to push for legislative change. He worked closely with prominent abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and became a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. His efforts were not confined to the northern states. He took his message to the South, advocating for the complete abolition of slavery. As an abolitionist, Douglass understood that the struggle for freedom could not be won solely through words. It required action, persistence, and, at times, a willingness to risk everything. In addition to his work with the abolitionist movement, Douglass also fought for women's rights, firmly believing in the interconnectedness of social justice causes. He was one of the few abolitionists who consistently championed the cause of women's suffrage, recognizing that the fight for freedom and equality transcended race and gender. His views on gender equality and his active involvement in the women's rights movement further distinguished him as a visionary who saw the broader implications of the struggle for liberty. While Douglass's success as an orator and writer grew, so too did the risks he faced. As a former slave, speaking out publicly about the evils of slavery, Douglass knew that he was a marked man. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1850, made it easier for slave owners to capture escaped slaves even in the northern states. Douglass's every movement was watched, and his life was constantly at risk. Yet he never wavered. His commitment to the abolitionist cause was unwavering, and he knew that his voice could change minds and push the nation closer to the realization that slavery was a moral abomination. Douglass's transformation from a fugitive slave to one of the most prominent voices in the abolitionist movement was a testament to his resilience and dedication. What began as a quiet desire for freedom became a lifelong mission to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. His speeches, writings, and actions not only raised awareness about the horrors of slavery, but they also inspired countless others to join the cause. Douglass's life was a reflection of the belief that one individual, no matter their background or circumstances, had the power to change the world. Frederick Douglass was not content to simply speak out against the institution of slavery. His activism extended to every aspect of life where injustice and inequality were present. By the 1850s, Douglass had become one of the most influential voices in the abolitionist movement, but his work was far from finished. His commitment to ending slavery was unwavering, but he also became increasingly aware that the struggle for freedom and justice went beyond the immediate abolition of slavery. It was also about ensuring the equality and dignity of all people, regardless of race or gender. Douglass's belief in the interconnectedness of all human rights causes shaped his actions and ideology. He firmly believed that the fight to end slavery was only one part of a broader mission to establish true equality in America. To Douglass, slavery represented the epitome of racial inequality, but its eradication was only the beginning of the work that needed to be done. He understood that once the chains of slavery were broken, the former enslaved individuals would still face a society that systematically dehumanized them. The fight for equality, therefore, had to address the institutionalized racism, discrimination, and legal barriers that would remain long after slavery's official end. Douglass's activism in the years leading up to the Civil War was deeply involved in both public and political spheres. He was more than just a speaker and writer. He was a strategic thinker who worked with various abolitionist organizations and political leaders. He sought to influence legislation, rally support for anti-slavery candidates, and work alongside those who believed in the cause of racial justice. Douglass also recognized that the abolitionist movement was not monolithic. There were competing visions for what the end of slavery would look like, and Douglass became a mediator between different factions, always advocating for a more radical and immediate solution to the crisis. Douglass's growing political awareness and activism were crystallized in his involvement with the Republican Party. Though he had initially been skeptical of political parties, he recognized that the Republican Party, which was founded in the 1850s, had the potential to effect significant change, particularly in its opposition to the expansion of slavery. His relationship with the party was not without tension, but Douglass saw in it a vehicle for the larger goals of abolition and equality. He met with key figures in the party, including President Abraham Lincoln, and worked behind the scenes to push for policies that would address not only slavery, but also civil rights for African Americans. As the Civil War began in 1861, Douglass saw it as the ultimate test of America's commitment to its founding ideals of liberty and equality. He understood that the war was not only a battle over the Union's survival, but also a conflict over the future of slavery in the United States. For Douglass, the Civil War presented an unprecedented opportunity to bring the issue of slavery to its decisive end. But Douglass was not content with a simple military victory. He believed that the war must also be fought for the complete and absolute liberation of Black Americans. Douglass advocated for the enlistment of Black soldiers in the Union Army, believing that their active participation in the war effort would demonstrate their full humanity and citizenship. He saw the opportunity for Black men to fight for their freedom not just as a means of military strategy, but as a means of moral redemption. By joining the Army, Black soldiers could prove their loyalty to the Union and their capacity to be equal partners in the struggle for freedom. Douglass tirelessly worked to encourage African American men to enlist, even going so far as to personally recruit soldiers and help organize Black regiments. Douglass's advocacy for Black soldiers extended to his work with the U.S. government during the Civil War. In 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Douglass took a cautious but optimistic stance. While he praised the proclamation for its symbolic importance, Douglass argued that it was not enough. He pushed for immediate, full emancipation and for the rights of Black people to be protected in the post-war society. Douglass's contributions to the war effort were not confined to military matters alone. He also lobbied for the extension of civil rights to freed slaves, recognizing that the promise of freedom was meaningless without full legal and social equality. In 1865, when the war finally came to an end and the Confederacy was defeated, Douglass celebrated the victory, but knew that the true work had only just begun. The passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was a monumental step toward justice, but Douglass understood that the road to true equality was still fraught with obstacles. His tireless work during the war had earned him recognition as one of the most significant leaders of the abolitionist movement. But the challenge of ensuring that Black Americans were truly free in a post-slavery society was still a vast and daunting undertaking. Douglass's post-war efforts focused heavily on the Reconstruction period, when the country attempted to rebuild and address the questions of citizenship, equality, and civil rights for the newly freed African Americans. He became a fierce advocate for the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Douglass's belief in the necessity of full integration of black people into American society led him to push for policies that would provide education, land, and economic opportunities to newly freed people. He saw education as one of the key factors in achieving true equality, and he worked to establish schools for black children in the South, believing that an educated populace was essential to the survival of a democratic society. While Douglass's efforts during the Reconstruction era were met with some success, he was also deeply disappointed by the eventual retreat from civil rights protections. The period of Reconstruction came to an end with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, leading to the rise of Jim Crow laws and the institutionalization of segregation. Douglass, ever the realist, understood that the fight for equality would be long and hard, and his work was not done. Throughout the remainder of his life, Douglass continued to speak out for racial justice, advocating for women's rights, equality before the law, and the full recognition of black Americans as equal citizens. As the Reconstruction period began to unravel, Frederick Douglass faced the bitter reality that the progress made during the Civil War was at risk of being reversed. The promise of equality, once envisioned in the wake of emancipation, was not being fully realized. The political and social climate in the South deteriorated, and racist policies began to take root once more, making Douglass's continued fight for racial justice more urgent than ever. Yet, despite the setbacks, Douglass remained unwavering in his pursuit of equality for all people, knowing that the struggle for justice was a long-term commitment that would extend far beyond his own lifetime. Douglass's work did not slow down after the Civil War. If anything, the challenges that followed only deepened his resolve. He became more actively involved in national politics, using his voice to push for the civil rights of African Americans and to demand that the federal government live up to its promises of liberty and justice. In the face of rising white supremacy and the entrenchment of discriminatory laws in the South, Douglass did not back down. He was a fierce advocate for the protection of the rights of black Americans, focusing on the need for legal equality, the extension of suffrage, and the end of segregation. One of Douglass's most significant contributions in the post-Reconstruction years was his role in the battle for women's suffrage. He had always believed in the intersectionality of civil rights and gender equality, understanding that the fight for justice extended to both racial and gender lines. Douglass attended the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which was the first women's rights convention in the United States, and he remained a staunch supporter of the movement for women's suffrage throughout his life. He understood that the fight for racial justice could not ignore the struggles of women, both black and white, who were also fighting for the right to vote and for full participation in public life. While Douglass supported women's suffrage, he also recognized the complexities of his position within the context of post-Civil War America. At times, there was tension between the civil rights movement for African Americans and the suffrage movement for women. Douglass, however, believed that racial and gender equality were both part of a broader struggle for human rights, and that the empowerment of one group would ultimately lead to the empowerment of all. His advocacy for women's rights was deeply personal, as he had seen his own mother, who had been enslaved, endure immense suffering, and he believed that ending discrimination based on gender was an essential step in fulfilling the nation's promises of liberty and equality. Douglass's advocacy for equal rights was also evident in his work to ensure that the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote, was fully implemented. He fought tirelessly against any attempt to disenfranchise black voters, working to protect the hard-won gains of the Reconstruction period. His commitment to universal suffrage meant that he consistently spoke out against policies that sought to prevent black people, particularly black men, from voting. Douglass's belief in the power of the vote was rooted in his understanding that political power was essential to achieving social and economic justice. Despite his tireless efforts, Douglass faced fierce opposition from both white supremacists and those who sought to maintain the status quo. The rise of Jim Crow laws and the resurgence of violent racism in the South were painful reminders that the struggle for equality was far from over. Douglass's advocacy for racial justice became even more urgent as the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, legalized racial segregation and upheld the doctrine of separate but equal. The decision was a stark reminder that the hard-won freedoms of the Civil War era were not permanent, and Douglass continued to fight against the legal and social structures that perpetuated inequality. Throughout his life, Douglass remained an eloquent critic of racial injustice, writing extensively about the dangers of white supremacy and the moral imperative for the nation to live up to its founding ideals. In his later years, Douglass increasingly focused on the importance of education in securing equal rights. He believed that education was the key to unlocking the potential of Black Americans and that an educated populace was essential to securing political and economic equality. Douglass's advocacy for education as a fundamental human right led him to work with various organizations and educational institutions to promote access to education for African Americans, particularly in the South. Douglass's deep commitment to the cause of racial equality extended beyond his lifetime. His legacy as a leader, orator, and writer shaped the course of the civil rights movement for generations to come. While the fight for racial equality was far from over by the time of his death in 1895, Douglass's contributions to the cause had laid the groundwork for future generations of activists. His work would inspire individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless others who would continue to push for justice and equality in the 20th century. Douglass's influence also extended beyond the borders of the United States. His speeches and writings were heard around the world, and he became an international symbol of resistance to oppression. His time in Europe, where he lectured and engaged with abolitionists and activists, helped solidify his reputation as a global leader in the struggle for human rights. Douglass's message of freedom, equality, and the inherent dignity of every person resonated with people around the world, and his ideas about justice and civil rights would inform movements for liberation across the globe. Even as Douglass fought for the rights of African Americans, he never lost sight of his broader vision for a just society. He often spoke about the importance of unity and cooperation in the face of oppression. Douglass understood that the fight for freedom was not just about the emancipation of one group of people. It was about the emancipation of all. He believed in the possibility of a nation where people of all races, genders, and backgrounds could live as equals, with access to the full benefits of liberty, education, and justice. This vision remained at the heart of his work, guiding him through the many challenges he faced throughout his life. Frederick Douglass was not just a towering figure in the abolitionist movement. He was also a profound and influential voice in shaping the public discourse of his time. As a former slave who became a leader in the fight for freedom and equality, Douglass's words carried unparalleled weight. His ability to articulate the moral and social imperatives of the abolition of slavery, along with his broader vision of human rights, made him one of the most important thinkers and writers of the 19th century. His impact extended beyond speeches and lectures. It shaped the very language in which Americans discussed freedom, justice, and equality. Douglass's life and work were a masterclass in the power of words. He understood that language was not just a tool for communication, but a weapon that could be used to challenge the status quo and provoke change. His writings were carefully crafted, combining emotional appeal with intellectual rigor. Whether in his famous autobiography narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, or in his countless speeches and editorials, Douglass had a unique ability to blend personal experience with universal themes of justice, freedom, and human dignity. His eloquent prose and powerful oratory made him one of the most persuasive voices in the abolitionist movement. Douglass's public speeches were often delivered with the precision and clarity of a man who had spent years refining his ideas. He knew that to be heard in the halls of power and in the hearts of ordinary citizens, he had to present his case logically and persuasively. He was a master of rhetoric, capable of moving an audience not just through emotion, but through careful argumentation. In his speeches, he deconstructed the logic of slavery, exposing the contradictions within a nation that prided itself on liberty while enslaving millions of people. Douglass's words were carefully chosen, aimed at appealing both to the moral conscience of his listeners and to their sense of reason. What set Douglass apart from many of his contemporaries was his unflinching commitment to truth. He was not afraid to speak out against the hypocrisies of his time, even when it meant confronting powerful figures or institutions. Douglass's critiques of the American system were often scathing, yet they were always grounded in the belief that the nation could live up to its highest ideals. He held up the Constitution as a document that, while imperfect, contained the seeds of liberty and equality. He believed that the United States could fulfill its promise of freedom, but only if it abolished slavery and dismantled the structures of racial oppression that had taken root. Douglass also understood that the fight for racial justice was not limited to the end of slavery. It was about reshaping American society to ensure that Black Americans were granted full rights as citizens. He used his platform to argue for the necessity of the Reconstruction Amendments, which sought to enshrine equality in the law. His writings were central to the public debates over these amendments, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, believing that they would serve as the foundation for a more just and equitable society. In addition to his work in the United States, Douglass's influence extended to global conversations about race and freedom. His travels to Europe, particularly to Britain, helped establish his reputation as an international advocate for human rights. During his time in Britain, Douglass gave speeches that captivated audiences and helped to galvanize the anti-slavery movement in the United Kingdom. He used his position to educate European audiences about the realities of slavery in America, offering a first-hand account that was impossible to ignore. His international stature allowed him to make connections with key figures in the abolitionist movement across the Atlantic, creating a global network of activists working for the same cause. Douglass's influence was not confined to the intellectual elite or political circles. He was also a powerful voice in the daily lives of ordinary people. Through his editorial work in newspapers such as the North Star, Douglass was able to engage with a broad readership. He understood that the fight for equality would not be won in the halls of power alone. It had to be fought in the hearts and minds of the general populace. Douglass's newspaper became a crucial platform for discussing not only the abolition of slavery, but also the broader issues of racial equality, women's rights, and social justice. In his later years, Douglass continued to write prolifically, contributing to debates on a range of issues, from the rights of Native Americans to the treatment of women and the poor. He was a man who believed deeply in the power of reason and dialogue, even in the face of opposition. His willingness to engage with those who disagreed with him, and his ability to articulate his ideas in a way that encouraged reflection, made him a respected figure not only among abolitionists, but also among those who might not have agreed with his views. Douglass also recognized the importance of the press in shaping public opinion. He used his writing not only to advocate for social justice, but to challenge the racist narratives that dominated mainstream media. In an era when racist stereotypes and dehumanizing images of African Americans were pervasive, Douglass's work in the press offered a counter-narrative. He wrote articles that exposed the brutal realities of slavery and the hypocrisy of those who defended it. His newspaper articles and editorials were an essential part of the abolitionist effort, providing readers with both moral arguments and factual accounts of the inhumanity of slavery. While Douglass was a skilled orator, it was his writing that ensured his message would have a lasting impact. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, remains one of the most important works in American literature. The narrative was not just a personal story. It was a powerful indictment of the institution of slavery and a call to action for all who read it. Douglass's writing became a tool of liberation, opening the eyes of many to the horrors of slavery and inspiring countless individuals to join the fight for abolition. Douglass's influence on public discourse extended into the political realm as well. He met with presidents, including Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, using his position to press for change at the highest levels of government. He believed in the power of the state to effect social change, but also understood that the fight for equality required constant vigilance. He knew that political leaders, no matter how well-intentioned, could not be trusted to achieve justice on their own. It was the responsibility of every citizen to advocate for justice, and Douglass made it his life's work to ensure that people, especially Black Americans, had a seat at the table of power. Frederick Douglass's impact on American public discourse was profound and far-reaching. His ability to combine reason, emotion, and moral clarity in his speeches and writings made him one of the most effective voices in the fight for justice. His work continues to serve as a model for activists and thinkers who seek to challenge injustice, speak truth to power, and advocate for the rights of the oppressed. As the years wore on, Frederick Douglass found himself navigating a post-Civil War America that, while no longer bound by the chains of slavery, was far from achieving the equality that he had fought for throughout his life. By the late 1800s, Douglass had witnessed significant political victories, such as the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and secured voting rights for African Americans. Yet, despite these legal triumphs, Douglass understood that the battle for true equality was far from over. His later years were defined by a continued struggle against the forces of racial discrimination, economic disparity, and social inequality that persisted even after the end of the Civil War. Douglass's role in shaping the post-war landscape was not confined to his earlier work as an abolitionist. By the 1870s and 1880s, he had become one of the most prominent African-American leaders in the nation. But as the nation's commitment to Reconstruction waned and white supremacy began to reassert itself in the South, Douglass grew more concerned about the future of African Americans. The withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, which marked the end of Reconstruction, gave rise to Jim Crow laws and systemic segregation. Douglass recognized that the political gains made during Reconstruction were vulnerable, and he continued to sound the alarm, speaking out against disenfranchisement and the erosion of civil rights. Douglass's concern was particularly focused on the plight of Black Americans in the South, where white supremacist violence and voter suppression had taken a dangerous toll. Although the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote, numerous states employed tactics such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation to prevent Black citizens from casting their ballots. Douglass, ever the champion of suffrage, remained an outspoken advocate for the protection of voting rights, understanding that political participation was key to securing the social and economic rights of African Americans. Douglass was also disillusioned by the gradual abandonment of the promises made to freedmen after the Civil War. He had hoped that, following emancipation, African Americans would receive support in the form of land grants, education, and economic opportunities, allowing them to build a foundation for a better future. However, many of these hopes were dashed by the realities of a country that was unwilling to invest in the full equality of its newly freed black citizens. Douglass's advocacy for land reform, particularly his belief that land ownership was essential for African Americans to gain independence and self-sufficiency, was one of the key elements of his post-war activism. He believed that without land, African Americans would remain economically dependent and unable to exercise full freedom. During these later years, Douglass also worked tirelessly to address the broader question of racial justice in America. He criticized both the federal government and white society for failing to fulfill the promises of Reconstruction. Despite his frustrations, Douglass did not retreat from public life or the fight for justice. Instead, he remained deeply involved in political and social causes, continuing to call for the extension of civil rights and the protection of the rule of law. His speeches during this period often focused on the themes of perseverance and resilience, urging African Americans to keep pushing for their rightful place in the nation. In the 1880s and 1890s, Douglass's advocacy expanded beyond racial issues to include the rights of women and Native Americans. Douglass was an ardent supporter of the women's suffrage movement, continuing his work alongside suffragists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Though he believed that the vote for black men should be prioritized, he never lost sight of the struggles faced by women. His advocacy for women's rights was integral to his broader vision of equality, which extended to all marginalized groups. Douglass also became increasingly involved in international affairs, using his platform to comment on issues of race and imperialism. As a global voice for human rights, he critiqued the policies of European colonial powers, particularly their exploitation of non-white populations. Douglass viewed colonialism as an extension of the same racial oppression that had been inflicted upon African Americans. His speeches on imperialism, particularly regarding the treatment of people in Africa and Asia, further cemented his reputation as a global champion of justice. In his later years, Douglass's personal life was marked by both triumphs and challenges. In 1884, he faced the loss of his beloved wife, Anna Murray Douglass, who had been his partner in both life and activism for over 40 years. Her death was a profound blow to Douglass, and he spoke candidly about his grief. He later remarried in 1886 to Helen Pitts, a white woman and the daughter of a prominent abolitionist. Their marriage, though founded on love and shared values, faced significant societal backlash, as interracial marriage was still deeply controversial at the time. Douglass's second marriage became an emblem of his belief in the possibility of racial harmony, even as many in society struggled with his choices. Despite the challenges of his later years, Douglass's commitment to advocacy remained strong. His work as an educator and writer continued to have a profound impact on American society. Douglass used his position to promote literacy and intellectual engagement within the African American community, believing that an educated populace was crucial for the success of the civil rights movement. He understood that education was both a tool of liberation and a means of self-empowerment for oppressed peoples. In his final years, Douglass also worked on building institutions that would support African Americans. He was involved with several organizations, including the National Equal Rights League and the American Missionary Association, which were dedicated to advocating for the civil rights of Black Americans. His contributions to these institutions, along with his continued public speaking, ensured that his voice remained one of the most prominent in the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Douglass's legacy, however, was not just in the laws he helped pass or the speeches he delivered. It was in the example he set for generations to come. His resilience in the face of adversity, his unshakable belief in the power of education, and his unwavering commitment to equality created a lasting framework for the civil rights movement. Douglass proved that while the road to justice was long and fraught with setbacks, it was a road worth traveling. His work paved the way for future generations of activists who would take up the mantle of equality and justice. In 1895, at the age of 77, Douglass passed away, leaving behind a legacy that would influence not only the generations of African Americans who followed him, but also the broader struggle for human rights across the world. Frederick Douglass's death in 1895 marked the end of a remarkable life that had transcended the very boundaries of what was thought possible for a person born into slavery. Yet his legacy did not die with him. Instead, Douglass's impact continued to resonate in the hearts and minds of successive generations who would take up the mantle of justice, equality, and human rights. His contributions to the abolition of slavery, the fight for civil rights, and the broader cause of human dignity set the stage for the civil rights movements of the 20th century and beyond. Douglass's work not only shaped the trajectory of American history, but also influenced global struggles for freedom. His role as a prominent intellectual, orator, and writer cemented his place as one of the most important figures in the abolitionist movement, and his advocacy for equality in all its forms laid the foundation for future generations of activists. The lessons he imparted through his speeches, writings, and personal example became the bedrock of the civil rights movement in the United States, providing a moral compass for the leaders who would rise in the 20th century to continue his work. The influence of Douglass was particularly evident in the early 20th century, when African American leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Philip Randolph drew inspiration from his writings and public advocacy. Du Bois, in particular, was influenced by Douglass's emphasis on the importance of education and political engagement as tools of empowerment for African Americans. Douglass's belief that an educated populace was essential to achieving social and political equality served as a guiding principle for Du Bois' own educational philosophy and his advocacy for higher education for Black Americans. Douglass's legacy also found expression in the growing movements for women's rights and gender equality. His unwavering support for women's suffrage and his belief in the interconnectivity of civil rights struggles set a precedent for future feminist movements. Figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with whom Douglass had worked during his lifetime, were inspired by his example of bridging the fight for racial justice with the cause of women's rights. The struggle for gender equality, like the fight for racial equality, drew heavily from the ideas Douglass promoted about the fundamental equality of all people, regardless of race or gender. In the decades that followed his death, Douglass's words and actions continued to inspire generations of African American activists. His call for political participation, his advocacy for the rights of Black men and women to vote, and his insistence on the importance of education became central tenets of the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X were profoundly shaped by Douglass's commitment to the struggle for racial justice. King, in particular, echoed Douglass's emphasis on nonviolent resistance and the power of moral suasion in his own calls for equality and justice. Douglass's influence extended beyond the borders of the United States. His work was known around the world, and his writings were circulated in Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. His global reach made him a key figure in the international abolitionist movement and in struggles for independence and human rights across the world. Douglass's condemnation of imperialism and his critiques of colonial powers, particularly those of European nations in Africa and Asia, made him a figure of international importance. His vision of freedom and equality transcended the specific historical context of slavery in the United States, providing a framework for broader liberation movements. Even as Douglass's life story became a symbol of the triumph of the human spirit, his words continued to challenge successive generations to push for the realization of his ideals. His insistence on the universality of human rights and his critique of racism, sexism, and injustice remained relevant well into the 20th and 21st centuries. His life was a constant reminder that the fight for equality is an ongoing endeavor, and that the work he began was far from finished. Douglass's autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, became a foundational text in the canon of American literature, not only for its historical importance, but for its literary qualities as well. The work was a powerful combination of personal story and political commentary, a bold declaration of the rights of the oppressed, and a compelling narrative of a self-made man. It has been studied and admired by scholars for generations, and it remains a touchstone for anyone interested in the history of slavery, civil rights, and American identity. In the years following Douglass's death, his contributions to public discourse continued to be celebrated by institutions dedicated to preserving his memory. His former home in Washington, D.C., was preserved as a National Historic Site, a place where visitors can learn about his life and work. Douglass's speeches, writings, and the public works that he helped to establish continue to be part of the educational curriculum in schools across the United States, ensuring that future generations understand the significance of his contributions to the nation's history. Douglass's legacy is not just one of historical importance, but one that has continued to shape the values of American society. His relentless commitment to truth, justice, and equality remains a model for activists, scholars, and citizens who seek to challenge oppression in all its forms. In an era where issues of racial justice, civil rights, and equality continue to demand attention, Douglass's example serves as a guide for how to address these challenges with integrity, courage, and perseverance. The work Douglass began continues today in the ongoing efforts to address racial inequality, economic disparity, and social injustice. His life was a testament to the power of individual agency and collective action in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. His words, written and spoken, continue to resonate, urging each new generation to stand up for freedom, to push back against injustice, and to fight for a world in which the inherent dignity of every human being is respected. In this way, Frederick Douglass's life and legacy will remain a powerful force for justice and equality for generations to come.